a classic mystery in the tradition of Agatha Christie, set in 1952, Thornwick Magna, England. Chapter 1. The Delphiniums were magnificent. The first Saturday of July 1952 arrived wearing its very best clothes. The sky above the village of Thornwick Magna was a deep, untroubled blue, and every garden along the high street seemed to be competing quietly for the sun's attention. Roses nodded over garden walls. Sweet peas climbed their bamboo frames in pink and cream and violet. And over the old stone wall of St. Cuthbert's churchyard, 3 magnificent delphiniums had reached a height of 6 feet, their spires so perfectly blue they seemed to hold a piece of the sky captive. Miss Jane Marple had noticed those delphiniums on her way into the parish hall grounds at 10:30, and she had thought at once of old Mr. Harbottle in St. Mary Mead, who had grown delphiniums with precisely that upright arrogance before his wife, a small shrewd woman, had put a stop to it, for reasons that had always seemed more personal than horticultural. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was a remarkably consistent thing. The Thornwick Parish Flower Show occupied the grounds behind St. Cuthbert's Church each year, spreading across the old tithe meadow in a comfortable arrangement of canvas tents, wooden judging tables, and white-painted signboards. This was its 34th consecutive running, interrupted only by the years of the war, and the residents of Thornwick Magna treated it with the gravity of a civic institution. Rosettes were competed for. Grudges of long standing were prosecuted through the medium of show vegetables. And on one occasion, 1947, the awarding of Best in Show to Mrs. Bracewell's fuchsia basket over Mr. Clement Dodd's climbing rose had produced consequences that had not fully resolved themselves even 5 years later. Miss Marple was visiting her niece, Mrs. Daphne Carrow, who lived in a comfortable stone cottage at the north end of the village, and who had pressed her aunt to accompany her to the flower show, with the particular insistence that signals something being quietly dreaded. Daphne's husband, Robert, was one of the 3 judges this year, and Daphne was not entirely confident that his judgment would be popular. "It is only flowers," Miss Marple had said gently, and Daphne had laughed, a slightly strained sound. They arrived to find the show well underway. The vegetable tent, always the most serious, had drawn a small crowd around the leeks, where Mr. Clement Dodd stood at a precise distance from his entry, giving every appearance of not caring about it, while clearly caring very deeply. Miss Marple noticed that he was wearing his good tweed jacket, which meant something. Men of a certain type only wore their good jackets when they expected to be congratulated. The flower arranging competition occupied 2 long tables inside the cool stone-floored hall itself. This was the event that drew the most female participation and, consequently, the most complicated emotions. Mrs. Harriet Blount, the vicar's wife, was widely expected to win. She won most years, and the fact that Mrs. Blount was a perfectly pleasant woman made her repeated victories no easier for anyone to bear. Miss Marple took a cup of tea from the refreshment table and moved slowly along the arrangement exhibits, examining each one with genuine appreciation and the particular attention she gave to all things, not just to what was there, but to what it suggested about the person who had made it. The exhibit that caught her eye was number 7. It was a tall, formal arrangement of white lilies, white stocks, and silvery green eucalyptus in a black lacquer vase, striking and rather cold, as though designed to be admired from a distance. The card beneath read, "Mrs. Vera Holsworth." "That's new," Daphne murmured, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow. "Vera Holsworth hasn't entered before. She only came to Thornwick 18 months ago. Some people are already calling her the incomer, which is rather unfair, I think, when you consider that the Parkers have only been here 12 years, and nobody calls them incomers." "Where did she live before?" Miss Marple asked. "Somewhere up north, Leeds perhaps, or Sheffield. She's a widow. Her husband died quite suddenly, I believe, and she came south for a fresh start." Daphne paused. "She's applied for the position of secretary to Dr. Fosbrook at the surgery. He's getting elderly and really needs someone organised." "And is she organised?" "Tremendously, by all accounts." Daphne glanced around. "She's here somewhere. Tall, dark hair. Looks rather like she's solving an equation even when she's standing still." Miss Marple smiled and moved on, but she kept Mrs. Holsworth's arrangement in her mind. There was something very deliberate about it. Everything placed exactly so. No room for accident or charm. The judging was due to begin at noon, which gave everyone 2 hours for rivalry to develop and refreshments to be consumed. Miss Marple, finding a vacant chair in a pleasant patch of shade near the apple tree, settled herself with her knitting and applied herself to the more rewarding occupation of watching people. She observed Mr. George Fanshawe, the chairman of the parish council, moved through the crowd with the careful attentiveness of a man who was seen to be interested in things he found uninteresting. He stopped at several exhibits, nodded approvingly, and moved on. He spent rather longer than necessary at the arrangement by Mrs. Holsworth, but that might have been coincidence. She observed Miss Patricia Croft, who was 34 and taught at the village school, standing very still beside the sweet pea exhibit, not her own, for she had not entered with an expression that was not quite wistful and not quite bitter, but something precisely in between. Miss Croft was looking, Miss Marple noticed, not at the flowers but at the window of the hall, through which the back of Mr. Fanshawe's head was visible. She observed Mrs. Blount stout, cheerful, competent, doing a thorough tour of the competition with the bright, slightly guilty pleasure of a woman who knew she had already won. And she observed, with a quiet sharpening of attention, the brief and apparently accidental meeting between Vera Holsworth and a man she had not yet been introduced to, a lean, sandy-haired man in his mid-40s with the careful posture of someone who had spent time learning to seem relaxed. He and Mrs. Holsworth stood together for no more than 30 seconds near the bookstall, and they did not look at each other as they spoke, and when they separated they went in precisely opposite directions. Miss Marple had seen that particular configuration before. People who were trying not to look like they knew each other always gave themselves away by trying too hard not to. She filed it carefully and returned to her knitting. At 12 minutes past noon, the judging had barely begun when a sharp cry came from inside the storage room adjacent to the flower hall, a low-ceilinged stone room where the extra tables and equipment were kept. The cry was followed by a heavy silence, and then by the rapid footsteps of Mrs. Ellen Folks, who served as show secretary, as she burst through the doorway with her hand over her mouth. "Someone fetch Dr. Fosbrook," she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady and therefore far more frightening than it would have been had she screamed. "Mr. Fanshawe, I think Mr. Fanshawe is dead." Chapter 2. The Parish in Conference. Within 10 minutes the flower show had ceased to be a flower show and had become something else entirely, a collection of frightened people standing about in the sunshine, with nothing useful to do, which is one of the more uncomfortable states the human animal can occupy. Dr. Fosbrook, who was 67 and had a manner that combined the reassuring with the brisk, emerged from the storage room after 8 minutes and confirmed what Mrs. Folks had, in her steady voice, already told them. George Fanshawe, aged 52, chairman of the parish council, was dead. He had been found lying behind the stacked folding tables, and the doctor had found no immediately obvious cause. "I've telephoned the police from the hall," he told the small cluster of people nearest him, which included Miss Marple, Mrs. Blount, Mr. Clement Dodd, and a young couple Miss Marple did not yet know. "They're sending someone from Fernham. We're to keep everyone here, I'm afraid." "George," said Mrs. Blount, in a tone of mild distress. "Good heavens! I was only talking to him an hour ago about the church roof fund. Was he a good man?" Miss Marple asked, of no one in particular. Dr. Fosbrook glanced at her. He had blood pressure. Nothing that should have killed him this morning. He paused, and the pause was of the sort that adds a great deal to what has already been said. "I've asked Mrs. Folks to see that no one leaves." Daphne appeared at Miss Marple's side. "Aunt Jane is dreadful. Do you think it was his heart?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Dr. Fosbrook is being very prudent." The police, when they arrived, consisted of a Detective Sergeant Baines from Fernham, a solid, reddish-faced man of about 40, with a notebook he carried with the care of a man who intends to use it, and a young constable named Webb, who positioned himself at the gate and looked anxious. Baines was not unkind, but he was efficient, and efficiency is not always comfortable. He set up a makeshift interviewing arrangement in the corner of the main hall, 2 folding chairs and a table, and worked through the witnesses with methodical patience, while the exhibits sat unregarded around him, and the judging rosettes lay uncollected in their envelopes. Miss Marple, waiting her turn, observed the room with the steady attention she gave to everything. She noted that Vera Holsworth sat alone near the door, her back very straight, her hands folded in her lap with the deliberateness of someone keeping them still. She noted that the sandy-haired man she had learned his name was Mr. Philip Ord, who managed the letting of properties in the area, had struck up a conversation with young Constable Webb that consisted mainly of Ord asking questions about how long this was all likely to take, which was the sort of question, Miss Marple thought, that people only asked when they were more anxious to leave than was entirely innocent. She noted that Miss Patricia Croft was crying, quietly, into a handkerchief, with the particular quality of grief that is private and long-standing rather than new. The death of a man she barely knew should not have produced those specific tears. When her own turn came, Miss Marple told Sergeant Baines precisely and accurately what she had seen: the arrangements, the crowd, the meeting between Mrs. Holsworth and Mr. Ord, and the cry from the storage room. Baines looked up. "You saw Mrs. Holsworth and Mr. Ord speaking, for about 30 seconds, yes, near the bookstall. They appeared to be making some effort not to seem acquainted." "Making some effort," Baines repeated, with the tone of a man deciding whether to record this. "They were standing slightly apart and not looking at each other, and when they separated, they went in exactly opposite directions." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I may be quite wrong, of course, but in my experience, people who are genuinely not acquainted simply ignore each other, whereas people who know each other and are pretending not to have a specific look." Baines wrote something. "You're very observant, Miss Marple." "I'm very old and I knit in public places," she replied. "People tend not to notice me, which is useful." The afternoon stretched on. The flowers, for which no prizes had yet been awarded, sat in their vases with magnificent indifference. The sweet peas moved gently in the draught from the open door. Mrs. Holsworth's white lilies remained cool and vertical, and completely unmoved by any of it. At 4 o'clock, Sergeant Baines announced that the initial post-mortem examination would take place the following morning, that everyone was free to go home, and that he would be requiring further interviews. He did not say what he suspected, but he had the particular careful stillness of a man who has already formed an opinion he is not yet ready to share. Walking back to Daphne's cottage along the summer lane, Miss Marple turned over in her mind what she had seen and heard. George Fanshawe, found behind stacked tables, in a room that had been locked until Mrs. Folks needed the extra chairs at noon. A man with blood pressure, but not dying blood pressure, in his doctor's opinion. The delphiniums were still magnificent over the churchyard wall. Miss Marple looked at them as she passed, and thought about a woman in St. Mary Mead who had added something to her husband's morning tea for 11 years before anyone had thought to look. She walked on. Chapter 3. What the village already knew. By Sunday morning, the village of Thornwick Magna had reached several firm conclusions, none of which necessarily bore any relationship to the truth, but all of which were held with conviction. Mrs. Clement Dodd, who had been at the Flower Show, and who considered herself an authority on parish matters, by virtue of having lived in Thornwick for 31 years, was certain it was his heart. A man his age, working himself up about the judging, rushing about in that heat-well, what else do you expect? She said this to Mrs. Blount outside the church after the morning service, and Mrs. Blount, who had survived too many parish meetings with George Fanshawe to grieve very deeply, agreed that the heart was the most likely explanation. Mr. Alfred Tasker, who kept the post office and prided himself on knowing things, was less certain. He had heard from his cousin's wife in Furnham that the police were asking specific questions, which meant, in Mr. Tasker's analysis, that there was something specific to ask about. Miss Patricia Croft, who had taught the village children for 9 years, and was therefore assumed by the village to be innocent of anything interesting, said nothing to anyone. She had spent Saturday evening and most of Sunday morning in her cottage with the curtains drawn, which her neighbours attributed to a headache. Miss Marple attended the morning service at St. Cuthbert's, a high, cool, stone building, with good acoustics and a vicar, Mr. Blount, who had the rare gift of preaching briefly, and afterwards stood in the churchyard with an expression of gentle interest, while information came to her from various sources, as it had a tendency to do. Old women who knit and ask mild questions are a remarkably effective intelligence-gathering mechanism. From Mrs. Folks, who had organised the Flower Show for 11 years and was still pale and shaken, she learned that the storage room had indeed been locked that morning. The key was kept on a hook in the small office off the main hall, and the hook had been accessible to anyone who entered the hall during the morning's setup. Several people had reason to go in and out of the office. Mrs. Folks herself, 2 committee members whose names Miss Marple noted carefully, Dr. Fosbrook, who had stopped by at 10 to confirm the afternoon schedule, and Mr. Fanshawe himself. From Mr. Blount, who had the amiable vagueness of a man absorbed in spiritual matters to the exclusion of most earthly ones, She learned that George Fanshawe had been the subject of some recent unpleasantness on the council, the details of which the vicar was careful not to specify, but which he hinted involved planning permissions, a new estate of houses proposed for the North Meadow, and opinions held strongly on both sides. From young Mrs. Harper, who was 26 and had a baby, and was therefore awake at all hours and observed rather more of village life than her neighbours supposed, Miss Marple learned something more interesting. On Friday evening, the evening before the flower show, Mrs. Harper had been awake at 11:30, feeding the baby when she had seen, from her bedroom window, a car parked for nearly 20 minutes outside the lane that ran behind the parish hall. She could not identify the car in the dark, but it was a medium-sized, dark-coloured saloon, and someone had sat in it without getting out, and then driven away. "Did you see the driver?" Miss Marple asked. "Only the shape of them," Mrs. Harper said. "Not tall. Could have been a woman, actually, or a small man." Miss Marple thanked her warmly, and stored this carefully alongside everything else. She had not yet spoken to Vera Holsworth or Philip Ord. She thought it might be instructive to see whether either of them sought her out first, which was sometimes the more revealing approach. The mouse that comes to the corner of the cheese, rather than the cheese being taken to the mouse. Daphne had invited several neighbours to Sunday lunch, which was a godsend. Thornwick Magna was small enough that most of the significant people were likely to know each other, and many of them were likely to appear. They did. Miss Marple, who had offered to arrange the flowers for the lunch table and had therefore stationed herself in the kitchen where all the significant conversation passed through, learned a great deal between 11 and 2 o'clock. She learned that George Fanshawe had, 3 months previously, blocked a planning application submitted by Philip Ord's property company for a small development on the edge of the village. The grounds for refusal had been procedural, which in the view of several people at Sunday lunch meant that Fanshawe had had reasons he was unwilling to state publicly. She learned that Fanshawe had been, until approximately 8 months ago, a frequent visitor to the cottage rented by Patricia Croft at the south end of the village, and that this had stopped abruptly, according to those who noticed such things after Vera Holsworth arrived in Thornwick. And she learned, from a remark dropped by Robert Carrow, and not picked up by anyone else, that Fanshawe had apparently been in the process of changing his will, according to something he had mentioned to Robert in passing at a council meeting in April. He had not said to whose benefit. Miss Marple arranged the sweet williams and stocks she had been given into a very creditable vase and brought it to the table, and smiled at everyone, and said very little. She had quite enough to think about. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Careful Words. The post-mortem results reached Thornwick Magna on Monday in the form of Sergeant Baines, who arrived at Dr. Fosbrook's surgery at 9:30 and emerged 40 minutes later, looking as though the morning had confirmed his suspicions rather than dispelled them. Miss Marple, who had brought Dr. Fosbrook a pot of her niece's damson jam as a pretext for a visit an elderly woman bringing jam to her doctor, was entirely unremarkable and had timed her arrival for 10 o'clock and found the sergeant just leaving. He tipped his hat at her with the politeness of a man who remembered her from the previous day and had decided she was someone worth being polite to. Miss Marple returned a cheerful nod and presented herself at the surgery door. Dr. Fosbrook received her without surprise. He was a lean, rather yellowed man, as though he had been slowly dried out by decades of medical concern, with sharp grey eyes that had retained their intelligence past the point where his body was beginning to tire. He accepted the jam with genuine pleasure. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, settling into the patient's chair, "whether you are at liberty to tell me anything about poor Mr. Fanshawe. I am only asking because I am Daphne Carrow's aunt, and she is very distressed, as you can imagine." Dr. Fosbrook looked at her over his glasses. He had been a doctor for 40 years, and he knew when someone was asking, because they had a reason beyond sentiment. He decided, after a moment, that he was rather glad someone was asking. "I can tell you what the post-mortem has indicated," he said carefully, "which is what the sergeant has already been told, and what will become known in due course in any case." He folded his hands on the desk. "George Fanshawe died of cardiac arrest. That is factually correct. What is also correct is that the cardiac arrest appears to have been precipitated by a significant elevation of potassium in his blood, a level far exceeding what his known dietary habits or medical history would explain." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Hyperkalemia," she said. Fosbrook raised his eyebrows. "You know the term. My nephew is a physician. I may have listened to more dinner conversation than he intended." She considered it. Potassium is not easily detectable as a poison, is it? In the sense that it is a naturally occurring substance. It is, Fosbrook said, which makes it particularly interesting. It is or can be difficult to distinguish from natural causes, especially in someone with a pre-existing cardiac condition. If the body had been cremated, for instance, rather than buried, the question might never have arisen. But Mr. Fanshawe was buried. His wife buried him. She specified it quite firmly. A pause. Margaret Fanshawe is in Wiltshire with her sister. She has been there for 3 weeks. George was a bachelor. The wife in question is his sister-in-law. He corrected himself. His late brother's wife, widow. She took charge of the arrangements. Miss Marple filed this. Is potassium chloride, the injectable form, something that would be accessible to many people? A medical professional would have access. Someone with knowledge and determination could obtain it by other means. It is not exotic. Fosbrook paused again, and this pause had weight. It requires knowledge to administer effectively, however. The dose must be right. Too little, and it has little effect. Too much, and the death is too rapid, which is obvious. The right amount, delivered at the right moment, in a person with an existing cardiac vulnerability, well, it would look very much like natural causes, Miss Marple concluded. It might very well have done, Fosbrook said, had the blood work not been thorough. He looked at the window. I ordered a full panel. I had a feeling. I can't explain it more precisely than a man his age, not so ill as to explain it, in a locked room. Sometimes you have a feeling. I have often found, Miss Marple agreed, that feelings of that kind are worth attending to. She left the surgery and walked slowly back along the high street, turning the new information over in her mind. Potassium, a medical compound, someone with knowledge of medicine, or access to it, or both, someone who had been able to reach George Fanshawe in that storage room, and who had either the means or the nerve to inject him, or who had found some other delivery method, because an injection required proximity and cooperation, and neither was guaranteed. She thought of the cup of tea she had noticed on the ground beside the body, which was in the police report Baines had mentioned in his careful official way. A cup, half finished, from the refreshment table. Potassium could, in the right compound, be dissolved in liquid. Not easily detectable, not bitter, not particularly distinctive. Miss Marple stopped outside the post office and looked up at the fine summer sky and thought about someone standing near the refreshment table with the specific knowledge of what they were doing and the composure to do it. "Can I help you, Miss Marple?" asked Mr. Tasker from inside, who had been watching her through the window. "Yes, actually," said Miss Marple. "I'd like some stamps, and I wonder if you could tell me a little more about Mrs. Holsworth." Chapter 5. The Woman in the White Arrangement. Mrs. Vera Holsworth lived in Ash Cottage, a stone-built house behind a beech hedge near the bottom of Church Lane. She had taken it furnished 18 months ago and had proceeded, by all accounts, to quietly transform it. The net curtains came down, a good rug appeared, and a small but carefully chosen collection of books appeared on the shelves. She was, the village had concluded, a woman of taste and method, which in a village of Thornwick's disposition was not quite the same as being liked. Miss Marple called on Tuesday morning with a small bunch of sweet peas from Daphne's garden and a carefully rehearsed mildness of manner. Mrs. Holsworth answered the door herself. She was tall as Daphne had said, with dark hair worn in a practical knot and a face that was handsome rather than pretty, precise in its features. She looked at Miss Marple with the particular wariness of an intelligent person who suspects that innocuous appearances may be misleading and then apparently decided she was being overcautious because she stepped back and opened the door fully. Miss Marple: "Do come in. Your niece mentioned you at the show." The sitting room was as the village had reported, spare, tasteful, very clean. A shelf of medical textbooks along one wall, Miss Marple noted these without looking directly at them, and a writing desk near the window that held an organized series of folders. On the mantelpiece, a single photograph of a man in his 50s with an open, unremarkable face. "Your husband?" Miss Marple asked, settling into the offered chair. "Yes, Thomas. He died 2 years ago." "I'm sorry. Thank you." The tone was the tone of someone who had been sorry for a specific and measured period, and was now on the other side of it. Mrs. Holsworth made tea with the efficiency of someone who did everything in the minimum necessary time. When she brought it through, she set it down and sat opposite Miss Marple with the posture of someone prepared for a specific kind of conversation. "I imagine," she said, "that you are somewhat more than a social caller." "I'm afraid I am rather a nosy old woman," Miss Marple said pleasantly. though I prefer to think of myself as observant. I noticed on Saturday that you and Mr. Ord appeared to be speaking, while giving the impression of not speaking. I found that interesting." Mrs. Holsworth was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea and then back at Miss Marple. "What did you do before you retired, Miss Marple?" "I never had a profession. I've simply lived in a village for a very long time and paid attention." She smiled. "It turns out that pays considerable dividends." Mrs. Holsworth made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she was serious again. "Philip Ord was my brother-in-law," she said. "My husband's younger brother. We have not had an estrangement in the family, for reasons I don't care to discuss fully, but he knew I had come to Thornwick, because Thornwick is where he operates his business, and I suspect he found my arrival inconvenient." "Why should your presence inconvenience him?" A pause, very precisely calculated. "My husband's death," she said, "was attributed to cardiac arrest. He had a pre-existing condition. His blood pressure was managed but elevated. He was 61. The doctors found nothing to contradict the diagnosis." Another pause. "I did not, at the time, question it. I was grieving. I was not thinking clearly." Miss Marple set down her teacup very carefully. "And now? I came to Thornwick because Philip is here. Because Thomas, in the last weeks of his life, had been changing his will, removing Philip as a beneficiary. Philip would have known this. Their solicitor is a mutual acquaintance." She looked out the window. "I don't have evidence. I have pattern recognition." "Pattern recognition is frequently underestimated," Miss Marple murmured. "I was a nurse for 12 years, Mrs. Holsworth said. Ward's sister, eventually. I understand potassium levels and what can cause them to spike. I understand why a post-mortem on someone with an existing cardiac condition might not look further than the obvious." She turned back. "When I heard on Sunday that George Fanshawe had died, and that the police were asking specific questions, I felt that I understood something." "Did you tell Sergeant Baines this?" "I told him about Philip, about our estrangement. He listened politely and wrote it down, and I could see he was wondering why I was telling him something that seemed to be about a different death in a different place." A slight edge in her voice. "I am not sure he believed me. Sergeant Baines," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "strikes me as a thorough man. He may be moving in that direction already." She considered it. "What was your relationship with Mr. Fanshawe?" "I had applied to work for Dr. Fosbrook. Fanshawe was on the surgery management board. He had, I was told, some reservations about my suitability, though the grounds were vague." A slight compression of her lips. "I wondered afterwards whether Philip had said something. He and Fanshawe knew each other through the planning committee." Miss Marple stood, slowly, and thanked her for the tea. At the door she paused. "The arrangement you entered in the flower shows the white lilies. It was very striking. I did it quickly. The night before." "The night before, yes." Miss Marple looked at the beech hedge, bright in the summer morning. "One more thing. Where were you on Friday evening?" "At around 11:30. Vera Holsworth met her eyes. "At home, alone." She paused. "Which I imagine is not terribly useful." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is honest, which is its own kind of usefulness." "Good morning, Mrs. Holsworth." Chapter 6. Something behind the bookstall. Philip Ord kept his property business from a converted stable building behind the old mill on the east edge of Thornwick, and Miss Marple judged, on the basis of the conversion's quality, that business had been very good at some point, and that the question of whether it still was might be worth exploring. She had not sought him out directly. Instead, she had mentioned to Mr. Tasker at the post office that she was looking for a cottage to rent for the autumn for a friend who needed country air, and Mr. Tasker had said at once that Ord Properties were the people to speak to, and had added, in the forthcoming way of small-town postmasters, that Philip Ord had been at the Thornwick Arms on Saturday evening, very quiet, and had left early, which was unusual, as he was normally the sort to remain for the second round. Philip Ord was in his office when Miss Marple arrived, having let herself through the unlocked stable gate and knocked on the open door. He was leaning over a set of site plans with the faintly hunted expression of a man for whom something was not going as intended. He straightened and looked at her. He had the kind of face that was agreeable without being memorable, sandy-haired, blue-eyed, the jawline beginning to soften. He was 43, she estimated, and he was carrying a specific kind of worry that sat around the eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Carrow's aunt, mentioned the fictional cottage for the fictional friend, and watched him go through the motions of professional pleasantness with the efficiency of someone who could do it with part of his mind, while the rest was elsewhere. "I expect," she said, after the pleasantries had been completed and the coffee he had offered had been brought and sat between them, "that this has been a most distressing weekend for you." You knew Mr. Fanshawe, I believe through the planning committee. Ord's expression did a small but visible thing. George and I had some dealings, yes. He was a useful man to know on the council. A slight emphasis on useful that suggested utility had been the entirety of the relationship. A shock. Absolutely a shock. He turned down your planning application, I believe. The North Meadow development. That's a matter of public record. His voice was even. These things happen in business. The decision was appealed. I'm confident the appeal will succeed. Still, Miss Marple said mildly, it must have caused some difficulty at the time. Temporary. He drank his coffee. Really just paperwork. I noticed you speaking to Mrs. Holsworth at the show, Miss Marple said, with the same mild tone, as though this were a natural continuation of what had gone before. You didn't appear to know each other very well. The pause was fractionally too long. Vera? Yes, she was my sister-in-law. We lost touch after Thomas died. These things happen in families. Her husband died of cardiac arrest, I believe. Another pause. This one she could have put a ruler to. Thomas wasn't well. His heart had been a problem for years. He set the coffee cup down with a deliberateness that was trying to seem natural. Why are you asking about Vera? I'm not, particularly, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I find people interesting. Living in a village all my life, I've come to think that most situations have more in them than they seem to at first glance. And a man dying at a flower show is certainly interesting. She folded her hands in her lap. Did you go near the refreshment table on Saturday morning, Mr. Ord? Before judging, I imagine I might have done it. There was tea. Yes, there was a particular cup of tea found near Mr. Fanshawe's body. I wondered whether you might have taken him a cup, as a gesture of goodwill. Philip Ord stood. He was trying to look naturally impatient rather than alarmed, and he was not quite achieving it. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I don't think I have anything more to say. He moved to the door in a way that was meant to seem like a businessman's reasonable termination of a meeting. I hope I've been helpful about the cottage. Tremendously helpful, Miss Marple said, gathering herself to leave. She paused in the doorway. One rather small thing. Mrs. Harper, she lives just along the lane from here. I believe mentioned seeing a dark-coloured saloon car parked behind the parish hall on Friday evening, 11:30 or so. She looked at the car park beside the stable, where a navy blue Humber Super Snipe sat in the shade. I expect there are several dark saloons in Thornwick. She left him in the doorway and walked back along the lane, and did not look back, because she had already seen what she needed to in the moment, before she turned the specific quality of a man standing very still and trying to decide what to do next. That evening she telephoned a contact of her nephew's at the General Medical Council and asked a quiet question about a man named Thomas Ord, who had died in Leeds 2 years previously of apparent cardiac arrest. The answer came the following morning and confirmed what she had already begun to think. Chapter 7. Patricia Croft's handkerchief. Miss Patricia Croft came to Daphne Caro's door on Wednesday morning with a tin of shortbread and the manner of a woman who had been steeling herself for something. Daphne, who was good-natured and not remotely suspicious, installed her in the sitting room with tea and an offer to fetch biscuits, which Miss Croft declined. Then, Daphne, with the instinct of a woman who understood atmosphere, if not always its cause, found reasons to be in the garden, and Miss Croft and Miss Marple were left alone. Miss Marple waited. She had found, in 7 decades of attentiveness, that waiting was one of the most productive things a person could do. I should have spoken to the police, Patricia Croft said, after about 40 seconds. I know that. I've been telling myself that since Saturday. But there are things that are difficult to say without other things coming out with them. That is nearly always the case, Miss Marple agreed, and it is rarely as fatal as it seems. Patricia was 34, a small, brown-haired woman with a forthright face that was currently occupied by an unusually complex expression. She had the hands of someone who spent a good deal of time with children slightly roughened, always a faint trace of chalk around the cuticles, and she held them together tightly in her lap. George Fanshawe and I were where we had been. I cared for him very much, she said, with the particular precision of someone who has rehearsed the phrasing. It began about 2 years ago. He came to the school for a council inspection and we spoke, and then we spoke again, and it went on, for about 14 months, and then it stopped. Last November, he ended it, very efficiently, a small wincing word. He said there were complications in his personal life. He said he needed to step back. He was kind about it, in a way that made it worse. These things often are, but I'm not telling you this because of that. Patricia drew a steadying breath. I'm telling you because on Saturday morning, Before the judging, I saw something. I was in the flower hall. I'd come in from the side door near the storage room because I wanted to look at my entry one last time. The arrangement I'd entered. Sweet peas. She paused. I saw Philip Ord. Miss Marple was quiet. He was coming out of the little office. The secretary's office. The one where the storage room key is kept. He had something in his jacket pocket. He was putting something into his jacket pocket. He saw me and he said good morning and walked on. And I thought nothing of it at the time, because I didn't know that anything had happened yet. What time was this? About 10:30, perhaps 11:15. And what did he put into his pocket? I couldn't see clearly. Something small, flat possibly, or cylindrical. She met Miss Marple's eyes. I should have said this to Sergeant Baines immediately, I know. But then people would ask why I was in the flower hall at that time, and why I was near the storage room door, and she stopped. I expect the sergeant will be more interested in Mr. Ord than in your reasons for being in the hall, Miss Marple said gently. You should tell him. Today, if possible. Will you come with me? If you'd like company. Certainly, Miss Marple considered. One more thing. You said Fanshawe ended the arrangement last November. Did he say anything at all about why, or about what the complications were? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, he said something odd. He said he'd been careless about someone who didn't deserve carelessness. I thought he meant me, at first. But the way he said it, he was looking out the window. He said it more to the window than to me. She twisted her hands. I thought afterwards that he might have meant someone else entirely. Miss Marple thought of Vera Holsworth, sitting straight-backed near the door of the Flower Show hall, with her hands folded and her face unreadable. She thought of Thomas Ord dying in Leeds, and his brother's careful distance from his widow, and the specific shape of a man who has done something and has had to live alongside it. Yes, she said, I rather think he might have. Patricia Croft went to see Sergeant Baines that afternoon. Miss Marple accompanied her as far as the door of the police station in Furnham, and then returned to Daphne's cottage and sat in the garden with her knitting for a long hour, working through what she knew and what she could not yet prove. The knitting helped. It always had. Chapter 8. The Long Shadow from Leeds. The information that came back from Leeds arrived in pieces over Thursday, assembled by Sergeant Baines with the patience of a man who has learned that the important things rarely arrive all at once. He came to Daphne's cottage on Thursday afternoon and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a manner that suggested he was both more certain and more cautious than when Miss Marple had last seen him. I took the trouble, he said, of following up the question you'd raised about Thomas Ord's death. The Leeds coroner's records show death by cardiac arrest, which was consistent with his known heart condition and not queried at the time. He looked at his notebook. However, the GP who had managed his condition told me, when I telephoned, that he had not expected Mr. Ord to die when he did. He'd said precisely this in a note he'd made at the time, a personal note in his own file, never sharing that the death was consistent but surprised him. A pause. He said he'd considered requesting a post-mortem and decided against it, because the family was in distress and he had no concrete reason to push for one. He has since expressed regret about that decision. Did he say what he would have been looking for? He said cardiac events in patients with managed hypertension can occasionally be triggered by acute electrolyte disruption. Baines looked at her steadily. Potassium. Yes, said Miss Marple. The problem, Baines said, setting his tea down, is that we are in the position of having a current case with post-mortem evidence and a historical case where no such evidence was gathered. I have spoken to the Chief Inspector in Leeds about exhumation, which is a difficult and lengthy process, particularly when the family has not formally requested it. Mrs. Holsworth has offered to request it as next of kin. There will be some time involved. He looked out the window. In the current case, the post-mortem is clear. The potassium levels in Mr. Fanshawe's blood were 3 times what they should have been. The question is delivery. The cup found near the body was tested. It contained a standard cup of tea with milk. No detectable additives, though potassium chloride in very specific compounds can be extremely difficult to detect in solution once diluted. The cup might have been diluted already, Miss Marple said. Half finished. Yes. The lab is looking again with different parameters. He folded his hands. Miss Croft's statement was useful. Mr. Ord coming out of the secretary's office at 10:30 is significant given the storage room key was on that hook. We have no physical evidence of what he took from the office. He denies being in the office at all and says he happened to be walking past when Miss Croft saw him. He would say that. He would. Baines was dry. We have also established that Mr. Ord's property business has been under considerable financial strain for the past 18 months. 2 developments have stalled, a third was refused planning permission by Mr. Fanshawe, and the bank has been asking questions. His brother's estate, which he inherited as sole beneficiary, has been the only stable element in his finances. Had Thomas Ord changed his will as intended, Philip would have received nothing. Motive on multiple fronts, Miss Marple observed. His brother's will and the planning refusal from Fanshawe, a 2-for-1 in a sense. The question, Baines said, is whether Fanshawe's death was planned from the start, or whether it was an opportunistic decision by Fanshawe at the Flower Show, Philip already in possession of the means, the storage room becoming accessible. He looked at her. Your view, Miss Marple. She considered this properly. The car by the parish hall on Friday night, she said. He went there the evening before. He may have been checking access, the layout, where Fanshawe was likely to be. The compound was probably prepared in advance. He's methodical. She paused. Like a man who has done this before. Baines absorbed this. We still haven't found the means of delivery. Injection would require Ord to have been alone with Fanshawe long enough, and we have no witnesses to that. The tea is the more elegant theory, but the lab work isn't there yet. Sergeant Baines, Miss Marple said. Did you search Mr. Ord's premises? Under warrant, yes. Yesterday. His car, his office, his home. A slight flatness. Nothing yet. His car. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. I noticed on Tuesday that he drives a Humber Super Snipe. A navy blue one. Mrs. Harper described the car outside the hall on Friday night as dark-coloured, fairly large. She pressed her lips together thoughtfully. There is one thing I have been wondering about, which perhaps I should have mentioned sooner. On Saturday morning, before the flower show opened, there was a period of roughly 20 minutes when the refreshment table was unattended. Mrs. Fawkes had mentioned to Daphne that the volunteer who was to manage it arrived late. During that window, the tea was already brewed and set out in the urns, and the cups were already in place. You're suggesting the cup was prepared before Fanshawe even picked it up? Not necessarily the cup, the tea in a particular cup, which was then placed in a position where it would naturally be taken, perhaps where someone with knowledge of Fanshawe's habits would expect him to stand. She thought of George Fanshawe, moving through the crowds with the careful attentiveness of someone being seen to be interested, a predictable man, a man of routine. He always arrived early. He was chair of the parish council. He would have gone to the refreshment table first. Baines was quiet for a rather long time. Then he stood, put his notebook in his pocket, and thanked her for the tea. You're quite formidable, Miss Marple, he said, without any condescension in it. I'm quite old, she replied. They're occasionally the same thing. Chapter 9. A Game of Patience. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous moment in any investigation, official or otherwise, was the moment just before the evidence was sufficient. It was the moment when the guilty party could still walk away, and when a premature move would accomplish nothing except to put them on their guard. The lab results came back on Friday, confirming a trace compound consistent with potassium chloride in the remaining dried residue at the base of the cup. The concentration, calculated against the estimated original volume, would have been sufficient in a person with Fanshawe's pre-existing cardiac condition. The discovery was, as Sergeant Baines put it on the telephone to Miss Marple, very nearly enough. Very nearly, she repeated. The defense will argue the compound could have come from a variety of sources, and we still can't place the cup in Ord's hands at any specific moment. He paused. I'm keeping him here on an informal basis, and asked him to remain in the village while inquiries continue. He's complying, but I can hear his solicitor in the background every time I telephone. Has anyone spoken to him about his brother's estate? The specific terms, he's confirmed he inherited as sole beneficiary. He's confirmed Thomas was in the process of revising the will. He claims he didn't know about the revision until after Thomas died. Baines was dry again, which would have been rather late to be relevant. Solicitors, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Thomas's solicitor. He mentioned to someone that Thomas was changing his will. Philip would have heard through the same channel. The solicitor is being less than forthcoming. Client confidentiality. Yes. Miss Marple considered. Sergeant Baines, I think I may attempt one more thing, if you'll permit it. A silence. I generally find, Miss Marple, that you do things whether I permit them or not, and that the results are instructive. What are you proposing? I thought I might invite Mr. Ord for tea, she said pleasantly, at Daphne's cottage, tomorrow afternoon, if he'll come. I'll ask Daphne to make it seem like a neighbourhood gathering where she can invite 1 or 2 others. The sort of thing that can't be refused without seeming rude, in a village context. And what do you expect to happen at tea? I expect to say something quite specific and watch what he does with his face. Philip Ord came to tea on Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 week after George Fanshawe had died, in the storage room of the parish hall. Daphne had invited him alongside Vera Holsworth, Mrs. Folkes, and Dr. Fosbrook, which gave the gathering the air of a slightly awkward social occasion rather than anything pointed. Miss Marple sat in the corner with her knitting, which was precisely where she wanted to be. The tea was consumed. The weather was discussed. Mrs. Folkes, who was still shaken, talked about the flower show in the past tense, as though it had happened many years ago. Dr. Fosbrook was kind and quiet. Vera Holsworth sat with her straight-backed composure and said almost nothing, but she watched Philip Ord with the particular attention of someone who has been watching him for a long time. Philip Ord was charming. He was good at it. The easy manner, the appropriate remark, the slight, self-deprecating anecdote. He was the most comfortable person in the room, which, Miss Marple reflected, was in itself rather interesting. I had a most interesting conversation with Dr. Fosbrook's colleague in Leeds, Miss Marple said, in a pause in the conversation, in the musing tone of an old woman thinking aloud. About Thomas's case. Did you know, Mr. Ord, that his GP had made a personal note at the time that the death had surprised him? Not inconsistent, you understand, just surprising. Something moved across Philip Ord's face. It was very small and very fast, and if she had been watching from across the room instead of the corner, she might have missed it. His expression didn't change that much he could control, but his right hand, which had been relaxed on the arm of the chair, closed briefly and then deliberately opened again. I didn't know that, no, he said, in a voice that was completely even. Of course, Thomas was buried, Miss Marple continued pleasantly, so any additional examination would require exhumation. I believe there may be an application in progress. She looked at her knitting. These things take time, of course. They do, he agreed. Vera Holsworth was looking at her brother-in-law. He did not look back. He was looking at Miss Marple with the focused attention of a man who had revised his estimate of someone and was working out what that revision meant. How long have you known Mr. Fanshawe? Miss Marple asked, as though this were merely conversation. Oh, 3 years or so. The planning committee. Ord smiled. He was a stubborn man about the North Meadow, but that's council business. These things work themselves out. Yes, I understand the appeal is progressing. She looked up. I suppose, with Mr. Fanshawe no longer there to be obstructive, the planning decision might go rather differently. The silence lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. Ord said, I wouldn't know about that. It's in the hands of the committee now, and he took a piece of shortbread with complete equanimity. But the hand had closed very briefly and opened again, and his eyes had the flatness of someone making calculations. Miss Marple noted all of this and returned to her knitting, and said nothing further of interest for the rest of the afternoon. Chapter 10. The Solicitor's Obligation. On Sunday, Miss Marple wrote 2 letters. The first was to her nephew, Dr. Raymond West, requesting certain specific information about the clinical presentation of acute hyperkalemia and the compounds most commonly used in its non-natural induction. The second was to a retired solicitor in St. Mary Mead, who had been a useful resource on professional ethics and their limits on previous occasions. The solicitor's reply arrived by first post on Monday. It confirmed what she had suspected, that client confidentiality applied to the living client's instructions, but that when a deceased client's estate was at issue and a potential crime might be indicated, a solicitor's obligations became more complex. Specifically, if a solicitor had been instructed to prepare a will revision and that instruction had been communicated verbally, in advance of drafting, there might be a question of whether the solicitor had an obligation to make that instruction known in the event of the client's unexpected death. She telephoned Sergeant Baines with this observation. Baines, to his credit, had apparently already been moving in this direction. I've been in contact with Thomas Ord's solicitor in Leeds, he said. He's been reluctant, but I've been persistent. He has confirmed, off the record, that Thomas came to see him 6 weeks before his death and verbally instructed him to prepare a revised will. A pause. The revision would have removed Philip Ord entirely and left the estate jointly between a local hospice charity and Mrs. Holsworth. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, and Philip would have inherited nothing. Nothing. Baines's voice was very level. The solicitor did not draft the will in time. Thomas died before it was formalized. Under the terms of the existing will, Philip inherited everything. Did Philip know about the intended revision? Thomas told him. According to the solicitor, Thomas told Philip himself in a telephone call 2 weeks before his death. He said, "This is what the solicitor has told me." Thomas told him that he felt it was only fair to be direct. "Thomas sounds like a good man," Miss Marple said quietly. "He does." A pause. "We now have motive for Thomas's death, motive for Fanshaw's death, circumstantial evidence for both, forensic evidence in the Fanshaw case, and a witness who placed Ord near the key to the storage room. We have his vehicle consistent with the one seen outside the hall on Friday night." Baines paused. "What we still don't have is a direct connection between Ord and a supply of potassium chloride in the appropriate concentration. How accessible is it? More than you'd think. Medical supply companies, veterinary suppliers. A person with patience and a plausible cover story could obtain a preparation." He paused. "Or a person with a contact in the medical field." Miss Marple thought of something. A small thing, the kind that sits quietly in the corner of the mind, waiting to be needed. "Dr. Fosbrook," she said. At Sunday lunch, Daphne mentioned that Fanshaw had had reservations about Mrs. Holsworth's suitability for the surgery position. Robert thought it was because Philip had said something to him. Yes. Dr. Fosbrook mentioned on Saturday that he'd stopped at the office at 10 o'clock to confirm the afternoon schedule, the same office where the storage room key was kept. He left before Fanshaw arrived, presumably. She paused. He had been Fanshaw's physician. He had access to his patient records. He would have known about the blood pressure, the cardiac vulnerability. A further pause. "I don't believe for a moment that Dr. Fosbrook is involved, but I wonder whether Philip Ord might have sought information from some medical acquaintance, not necessarily here, someone in Leeds who had access to Thomas's medical records. That is," Baines stopped. "That is a line I hadn't pursued. A pharmacist, a practice nurse. Someone Philip knew from that period, who could have described the precise parameters of Thomas's condition and what would reliably produce the effect." She paused. "And who might have done the same for him with Fanshaw's, once Philip made it his business to learn the details from Fanshaw's own GP. Fanshaw was registered with Fosbrook. His records would be at the surgery." "Yes." Miss Marple was very quiet. "And Mrs. Holsworth had applied to work at the surgery. If Philip had wanted advance information about Fanshaw's condition and had not been able to get it directly, he might have stopped. He might have arranged for someone he trusted to be in a position to access those records," Baines said. "I don't think Mrs. Holsworth did any such thing," Miss Marple said firmly. "I am quite certain of that. But I think Philip may have believed she would be useful there, and when she wasn't offered the position when Fanshaw blocked it, he lost one potential avenue." She paused. "Which would explain why blocking the appointment, as well as the planning permission, pushed him toward more direct action." Baines said, "Miss Marple, I am going to ask you formally to remain available for a further discussion with me and my chief inspector in the next few days." "I had no intention of going anywhere," she said. "I am helping Daphne deadhead the roses this week." Chapter 11. The Blue Cup and the Bench. The break came, as breaks often do, from an unexpected direction. On Tuesday morning, a woman named Mrs. Greta Palmer, who had been on the refreshment committee at the Flower Show and who had been away visiting her daughter in Bristol since Sunday, returned to Thornwick and read the local paper over breakfast. She then telephoned the police station in Furnham in a state of quiet agitation. She had, she said, something to tell Sergeant Baines that she had not thought relevant until she understood what had happened. She had been helping set up the refreshment table on the morning of the Flower Show. She had left at 9:30 to attend to a problem with the jumble sale table. When she returned at 10 past 10, one of the cups which she had set out herself in neat rows of 20 was out of place. It had been moved to the end of the table, slightly apart from the others, turned with its handle facing outward. She had thought nothing of it. Cups moved. She had left it where it was and gone on with her work. She could describe it. It was a blue-rimmed white cup, one of the hall's own sets. She had noticed it particularly because the handle was slightly chipped, and she had almost removed it from the arrangement on the grounds that it was unsightly, but had decided it would do for the morning. The cup found near Fanshaw's body had a chipped handle. This was in the police report. Baines confirmed it with one phone call. The time window was critical. Between 9:30, when Mrs. Palmer left, and 10 past 10, when she returned, 40 minutes, the table had been unattended. Philip Ord had been seen by multiple witnesses at the Flower Show from 9:50 onwards. Whether he had arrived earlier was not established, but Mrs. Harper's car outside the hall on Friday night was not Philip Ord attending a committee meeting. He had been there the previous evening, Miss Marple concluded, not to check the layout he knew from years of parish events, but to leave something, or to take something, or both. The cup, she told Sergeant Baines when he called her. He prepared the compound on Friday evening. He may have had a small vial, something that could be slipped into the cup without being opened. He could have done it in seconds, even with someone nearby, if the compound was pre-prepared in a small sealed container. We didn't find a vial, Baines said. No, he would have disposed of it immediately. A man who had already done this once was not going to be careless. She paused. Did you look in the churchyard? A silence. The churchyard. He left the refreshment table and went almost immediately into the churchyard. According to Mrs. Folks's timeline, she saw him there at about 10:20, she told you, looking at the flower arrangements over the wall. Miss Marple paused. The delphiniums were magnificent. Everyone was admiring them. It would have been very natural to go and look. And in a churchyard, there are any number of places at the base of a wall, beneath a yew tree, in long grass where something small might be dropped or pressed into the soil. Baines was quiet for a long moment. Then, we'll look. They found it on Wednesday afternoon, a small glass vial, sealed with a rubber stopper, buried beneath the leaf litter at the base of the churchyard's northern wall. It was empty. The residue inside was sent immediately to the lab. The results confirmed potassium chloride in a concentration consistent with what had been found in the cup residue. On Wednesday evening, Sergeant Baines arrested Philip Ord on suspicion of the murder of George Fanshawe. Ord said nothing. He looked at Baines with the particular blankness of someone who has been waiting for this moment long enough that it had ceased to be surprising. Vera Holsworth, when Baines told her, sat down suddenly on her kitchen chair. She pressed her hands flat on the table and stared at the grain of the wood for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, "Will it be enough for Thomas too?" "We're pursuing it," Baines said. "The exhumation application is moving forward." She nodded, once, and said nothing else. Miss Marple, told the news by Sergeant Baines on the telephone that evening, thanked him, and sat for a while in the quiet of Daphne's sitting room, with her knitting in her lap and the summer light moving slowly across the floor. She thought of Thomas Ord, who had told his brother directly that he was changing his will, because it had seemed only fair to be direct. A good man, being direct with someone who had already decided on a remedy. She put the knitting away and went to see if Daphne needed help with supper. Chapter 12. What Miss Marple knew about patience. Daphne Carrow found her aunt in the garden on Thursday morning, sitting in the wooden chair under the old apple tree with a cup of tea and the expression she recognized from childhood as the one that meant thinking had been completed and something was being settled. "Are you all right, Aunt Jane?" "Perfectly, dear. I was just reflecting." A pause. "I was thinking about patience." Daphne sat down in the other garden chair. She had learned over the years not to ask the obvious question directly when her aunt was in this mood, because the answer would come in its own shape. "The thing about Philip Ord," Miss Marple said, "is that he had a great deal of it. Patience. He killed his brother. I am quite certain of it, even though we don't yet have the laboratory confirmation from the exhumation, and then he waited 2 years. He waited for the estate to clear, for the dust to settle, for Vera to arrive in Thornwick and become an inconvenience rather than an immediate threat. He didn't rush. But then he killed Mr. Fanshawe," Daphne said, "which seems rather rash." "It does, but I think the circumstances converged in a way he hadn't anticipated. Fanshawe's planning refusal had put the business into serious financial difficulty. Vera's application to the surgery had been blocked, removing what Philip may have seen as useful intelligence about Fanshawe's medical status, or perhaps he simply resented the obstacle for its own sake. And the appeal against the planning decision was not certain to succeed, particularly with Fanshawe actively opposing it. So several pressures at once, and a man with existing means, the compound, the knowledge, the nerve, who was running out of time. Miss Marple drank her tea. He must have felt, I think, that it was almost elegant. A second death that looked like the first. Natural causes. An existing cardiac condition. A cup of tea at a flower show. She paused. He hadn't reckoned sufficiently on Dr. Fosbrook's thoroughness, or on the fact that a locked storage room in the middle of a public event was not as untraceable as a man alone in his house in Leeds. "And he hadn't reckoned on you," Daphne said. "I suspect he hadn't reckoned on any observer at all," Miss Marple said. "People who plan carefully often forget that they cannot plan for what they don't know is there. I was an unknown quantity. I had no reason to look at him in particular. And then he and Vera had that very telling conversation near the bookstall, and I began to look. Daphne was quiet for a moment. How did you know it was him and not her? He could have told the same story about Vera, that she'd come here because she suspected him. He could have, and in the first few minutes of speaking to her, I was not certain. Miss Marple considered. Two things. The first was the nature of her knowledge. She understood the medical mechanism because she had been a nurse. She knew it was possible. But knowing something is possible is very different from having done it. Her grief about Thomas was real, and it was specific. She grieved the man who had been careless, not an abstraction. People who have been deceived grieve very differently from people who are deceiving. A pause. The second was simply that she told me the truth, and people rarely volunteer information that incriminates them if they have something better to hide. He'd had practice, Daphne said, with a slight shiver. Yes, he'd had practice. Which is perhaps the most sobering aspect. Miss Marple set down her cup. It's the reason Vera's instincts were right, even though she couldn't prove them. She knew her brother-in-law. She knew the shape of him. She came here because she was not willing to let it be finished and settled, and she was prepared to be thought eccentric or suspicious for the sake of making something happen. She was very brave, Daphne said. She was extremely brave, and extremely patient in her own way. The difference between her patience and his is the difference between waiting in order to build something and waiting in order to prevent something. The first is hopeful, which is a sustainable state. The second is dread, which is not. Miss Marple stood, slowly, and looked at the apple tree above her. I hope she can be free of it now. The dread, the laboratory results confirming potassium chloride in Thomas Ord's exhumed remains, arrived 5 weeks later. Philip Ord was charged with both murders. He continued to say very little. Patricia Croft went back to her school at the start of September and was seen, by the end of term, walking in the village with a quiet and private kind of cheerfulness that had not been there the previous year. Whatever she had set down in the course of the summer, she appeared to have set it down thoroughly. Mrs. Blount was awarded Best in Show at a rescheduled competition in August, which pleased nobody except Mrs. Blount, which was as it should be. Vera Holsworth was offered the position at Dr. Fosbrook's surgery in September. She accepted it. She continued to live at Ash Cottage, with the good rug and the careful books, and the single photograph on the mantelpiece, and the particular composure of a person who has endured the worst thing and come out the other side, with their understanding of the world enlarged, and their estimate of people neither improved nor worsened, but deepened. Miss Marple left Thornwick Magna on the second Tuesday of August. On the early bus that ran to the railway junction, Daphne pressed a jar of damson jam into her hands and said she must come again soon, and Miss Marple said she would, and meant it. She looked at the delphiniums over the churchyard wall as the bus passed. Someone had staked them more firmly since the summer. They were still rather magnificent. She settled back in her seat with her knitting and thought, in that comfortable, unhurried way she had, about human nature, about how it remained, across all its variations, fundamentally comprehensible in its greed, in its patience, in its willingness to harm, and equally in its willingness to stand in a stranger's village for 18 months and wait, quietly, for the truth to be found. Neither, she supposed, was more surprising than the other, and both, in the end, were about what people believed they were owed. The bus moved through the summer lanes, and she knitted, and the morning was very fine.